The weight on Leo's shoulders wasn't just the canvas of his backpack. It was the gravity of a dream. A dream heavy with nebular distant galaxies and the cold, perfect mathematics of orbital mechanics. But on a sweltering Houston afternoon, in a world that often judges the cover, not the contents, that weight became a suspicion, a threat. This isn't just a story about a misunderstanding. It's a story about what happens when prejudice collides with brilliance, when a boy reaching for the stars is pulled down to earth by fear. It's the story of a phone call, a police siren, and a single laminated card that held the power to shatter an accusation and ignite a firestorm of consequences that no one else saw coming. The heat in Houston's Third Ward was a physical presence. It shimmered above the asphalt, hugged the old shotgun houses, and clung to the back of Leo Jones's neck like a damp towel. At 17, Leo was more accustomed to the controlled, sterile chill of a server room, or the hushed reverence of a library, than the oppressive humidity of a Texas summer. But his grandmother, who had lived in this same house for 54 years, insisted that a daily walk was good for the soul and the circulation. So he walked. His backpack, a well-worn grey Osprey, was his portable universe. Tucked inside was a MacBook Pro, displaying complex CAD designs for a new type of CubeSat thruster. 2 moleskin notebooks filled with frantic, elegant equations, a dog-eared copy of Pale Blue Dot by Carl Sagan, and his lunch, a slightly squashed turkey and provolone sandwich. This backpack was an extension of his body, a second brain. It went with him everywhere, from his grandmother's kitchen table to the hallowed halls of the Johnson Space Center. This summer was the culmination of everything he had ever worked for. He wasn't just another high school kid. He was a summer intern in the propulsion systems branch, a position so competitive it was practically mythical. He was the youngest intern they had accepted in over a decade. He was living a dream, painted in rocket fuel and starlight. His walk took him past the familiar landmarks of his grandmother's neighborhood, the mural of George Floyd, a somber and powerful reminder, the corner store with the faded Dr. Pepper sign, and the new impeccably manicured community garden that had sprung up a year ago. The garden was a symbol of the new Third Ward. It sat on a formerly empty lot, now fenced with tasteful black iron and filled with raised beds of heirloom tomatoes, kale and flowers with names he didn't know. It was meticulously clean, a stark contrast to the beautiful lived-in chaos of the surrounding area. A large, professionally printed sign near the gate read, "Oakwood Community Commons, a green space for our residents, Est, 2023. Leo often cut through the park adjacent to the garden. He liked the quiet. Today he noticed a new addition to the garden's fence, a smaller laminated sign. He paused, his curiosity piqued. He adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. Notice: this area is under community surveillance. Suspicious activity should be reported immediately. Help us keep our community safe and clean. Leo felt a faint, familiar prickle of unease. Suspicious activity. The phrase was a loaded weapon, and he'd been on the wrong end of its barrel before. He was a 6'2" black teenager. In some people's eyes, his very existence was suspicious activity. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. He was just walking. He had a right to be here. He pulled out one of his notebooks and a pen leaning against the wrought iron fence. An idea for optimizing the propellant flow in his thruster design had been nagging at him, a mathematical itch he needed to scratch. He found a blank page and began to write. His brow furrowed in concentration. The world around him melted away, replaced by the elegant dance of numbers and symbols. He was no longer a teenager in a hot park. He was an engineer solving a problem, He didn't notice the curtains twitch in the window of the pristine two-story craftsman house across the street. He didn't see the pair of eyes narrowed in scrutiny. He was just a boy with a backpack and a dream lost in a universe of his own making. And that to the woman watching him was the most suspicious thing of all. Cynthia Miller considered herself a pillar of the community, or more accurately, a pillar of the new community. She and her husband Mark had bought their renovated Craftsman 2 years ago for what they considered a savvy investment in a neighborhood on the upswing. She was the president of the Oakwood Community Commons Committee, the one who organized the planting days, managed the budget, and drafted the strongly worded emails about putting gardening tools back in the shed. She saw herself not as a gentrifier, but as a pioneer, a civilizing force. She brought order, organic kale, and rising property values. The sign on the fence. That was her idea. A gentle deterrent, she had called it at the last committee meeting. From her living room window, which offered a perfect unobstructed view of the garden, she had a clear line of sight on the boy. She'd never seen him before. He was tall, lanky, and wearing a hoodie despite the suffocating heat. And the backpack, it looked heavy, bulky. He was just lingering. He'd been standing by the fence for nearly 10 minutes, not entering, not passing by. Just standing there, scribbling in a little book. He kept glancing at the garden, then down at his book, then back up. Cynthia's heart began to beat a little faster. Her mind, a well-oiled machine of worst-case scenarios, kicked into high gear. Casing the joint, she thought. That's what they called it. He was looking for security weaknesses. Maybe he was planning to come back later, hop the fence, and steal the solar-powered sprinklers they had just installed. Or worse. Mark came into the room holding a coffee mug. "What are you looking at?" "There's someone outside," she said, her voice low and tense. "By the garden." Mark, a perpetually tired investment banker, squinted. "He looks like a kid. Cynthia. He's been there for a while. He's writing things down. It's suspicious." "Maybe he's a poet," Mark said, with a slight chuckle, turning to leave. "Musing about the beauty of our heirloom tomatoes." Her jaw tightened. Mark didn't understand. He didn't see the subtle signs of decay she was constantly fighting against. He didn't spend his days worrying about their investment, their safety. "I'm serious, Mark. He doesn't belong here. I've never seen him before. He's probably from one of those other blocks." Those other blocks. The phrase hung in the air. It was code, a carefully constructed wall between the pioneers and the people whose families had lived here for generations. The boy Leo was still there, completely oblivious. He'd flipped a page in his notebook and was now sketching something, a series of interconnected circles and cones. To Cynthia, it looked like a diagram, a plan. The final straw was when Leo reached into his backpack. Cynthia held her breath. What is he pulling out? A tool, a weapon. He rummaged for a moment before pulling out a bottle of water. The relief she felt was immediately replaced by a fresh wave of suspicion. It was a feint, a misdirection. He was being clever. "That's it," she said, her voice firm. She pulled out her iPhone, her thumb hovering over her favorites. "I'm calling it in." "Cynthia." "For God's sake, don't." Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're going to call the police on a kid for drinking water." "I'm calling about a suspicious individual loitering and casing private property," she corrected him, her voice dripping with righteousness. "He's been here for 15 minutes. He's wearing a hoodie. He has a large, unidentified pack. I'm not taking any chances. It's my duty as a resident. Her finger tapped the screen. She knew the non-emergency number by heart. As the dispatcher's voice came on the line, Cynthia Miller felt a surge of validation. She was doing the right thing. She was protecting her home. She was keeping her community safe. Across the street, Leo Jones capped his pen, satisfied. He'd solved the equation. He took a long drink of water, the cool liquid a welcome relief from the heat. He zipped up his notebook, slid it back into his grey Osprey, and decided to head home. It had been a good walk. Leo had just turned the corner, his mind already shifting from propellant flow to what his grandmother might be making for dinner, when the patrol car slid silently to the curb ahead of him. It didn't use its siren, just a soft, authoritative whoop that cut through the afternoon haze. A second car pulled up behind him, effectively boxing him in. Leo's blood ran cold. The ambient heat of the day vanished, replaced by an internal icy dread. Every casual instruction from his father, every somber warning from his grandmother, every news story he'd ever seen, coalesced into a single crushing weight in his chest. Keep your hands visible. Don't make any sudden moves. Be respectful. Yes, sir. No, sir. 2 officers got out of the first car. They were both white. The older one, stocky with a greying moustache, had a weary look in his eyes. The younger one was trim alert, his hand resting almost casually on the butt of his sidearm. "Afternoon, son," the older officer said. His voice wasn't hostile, but it was firm, a voice that expected and received compliance. "Can we have a word with you for a moment?" "Yes, sir," Leo said, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. He forced himself to stop to keep his hands out of his pockets, away from the backpack that suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. From across the street, Cynthia Miller watched from her window, her phone clutched in her hand. She felt a knot of anxiety mixed with a grim sense of justification. "See," she thought, "they're taking it seriously." It was suspicious. "We received a call about a suspicious individual in this area." The younger officer said, his eyes scanning Leo from head to toe, lingering on the backpack. "Someone matching your description?" Suspicious Leo asked, his mind racing. I was on a walk. I live just around the corner with my grandmother." "That may be the older officer whose name tag read Sergeant Callahan," said. But the caller was concerned. "Said you were watching the community garden taking notes." Leo's confusion was quickly being eclipsed by a burning sense of humiliation. I was working. I'm an engineer. Well, an intern. I had an idea, and I was writing it down before I forgot." The younger officer, Denton, exchanged a look with Callahan. It was a look Leo couldn't quite decipher, but it felt dismissive. An engineer. Right kid. "What's in the backpack?" Denton asked, his tone sharper now. This was the moment. The escalation point he'd always been warned about. He had to stay calm. "My laptop. My notebooks. My lunch," Leo said, slowly and clearly. "Sir." "You mind if we take a look?" Denton asked. It wasn't really a question. Leo hesitated, not because he had anything to hide, but because of the principle, the violation. His entire world was in that bag. His designs, his ideas, his intellectual property. But he knew this wasn't a debate he could win. A black teen arguing with 2 armed police officers on a residential street was a losing proposition. "Okay," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He made a slow, deliberate move to slip the backpack off his shoulders. "Hold on." Denton said, his voice sharp, making Leo freeze. "Just put it on the ground." Slowly. Leo complied, his cheeks burning with shame, as he placed his treasured backpack on the dusty sidewalk, as if it were contraband. He felt exposed, judged. He could feel the eyes from the house across the street. He could feel the weight of history on his shoulders. Callahan knelt down, his expression unreadable, and carefully unzipped the main compartment. He pulled out the MacBook, then one of the moleskin notebooks. He opened it. His eyebrows shot up. The page was a cascade of what to an untrained eye would be gibberish. Complex calculus, differential equations, and intricate diagrams of thrust vectors and combustion chambers. "What the hell is this?" Denton asked, looking over his partner's shoulder. Callahan didn't answer. He just kept flipping through the pages, his weary expression slowly morphing into one of pure confusion. He looked from the notebook filled with graduate-level physics to the tall, nervous teenager standing before him. The two things did not compute in his experience. "I told you," Leo said, finding a sliver of his voice. "I'm an engineering intern. I work on propulsion systems." "Propulsion systems for who?" Denton scoffed. "Your science fair project." Leo took a deep breath. The humiliation was a bitter pill, but his pride was starting to push back. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to be dismissed as a liar or a delinquent. "No, sir," he said, his voice steady now. He met Denton's gaze. "For NASA." There was a moment of silence. The only sound was the hum of a distant lawnmower and the pounding in Leo's ears. Denton let out a short, incredulous laugh. "NASA, kid." "Do you really expect us to believe that it's the truth?" Leo insisted. He thought of the one thing in his wallet that could end this nightmare. "I have my ID." "All right," Callahan said, closing the notebook and standing up. He seemed to be reassessing the entire situation. "Let's see it." Slowly, deliberately, Leo reached for his back pocket. He pulled out his worn leather wallet, flipped it open, and extracted the laminated card. He held it out. The card was simple, a blue NASA meatball logo. On the top left his photo on the right, an admittedly awkward photo where he was trying not to smile too wide, and his name Leo Jones. Below that, in bold letters, it read, "Johnson Space Center, Propulsion Engineering Intern." Callahan took the ID and studied it. He turned it over, looking for any sign of forgery. He held it up to the light. It was real. Denton leaned in his cynical smirk, faltering as he looked at the official government seal. The entire dynamic of the encounter shifted in an instant. The air, thick with suspicion and accusation, suddenly cleared. Leo was no longer a suspicious individual. He was no longer a potential criminal. He was a NASA intern, a kid who worked on rockets. He was one of the good ones. Callahan handed the ID back, a new, almost respectful tone in his voice. "I apologize for the misunderstanding, Mr. Jones." He shot a glare at Denton, who now looked deeply uncomfortable. "We were just following up on a call." "I understand," Leo said, though he didn't. Not really. He didn't understand how a walk in his own neighborhood could lead to this. Across the street, Cynthia Miller watched the exchange, unable to hear the words, but fluent in the language of body posture. She saw the boy hand over a card. She saw the officers' attitudes change completely. They were standing back now. One of them, the older one, even looked apologetic. They were handing the boy his backpack. They were leaving. She didn't understand. What was on that card? What could possibly have diffused the situation so completely? Her sense of righteous validation curdled into a sour mix of confusion and indignation. They had just let him go. Her suspicious individual was walking away scot-free. As Leo shouldered his backpack, the weight felt different now. It was still his universe, but it had been breached, inspected, and judged. He gave the officers a curt nod and turned to walk home, every ounce of his being focused on not looking back at the house with the watching eyes. He didn't know it yet, but the confrontation wasn't over. It had just begun, and someone had been filming the entire thing. 2 blocks away, sitting in a beat-up 2012 Honda Civic, Maria Sanchez lowered her phone. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, not from fear, but from the electric thrill of a journalist who knows they have the story. Maria was a freelance reporter, which was a glamorous way of saying she ran a local news blog called Houston Unfiltered and barely made her rent money. She specialized in stories the big networks ignored: zoning disputes, city council corruption, and her personal passion project, the human cost of gentrification in historic neighborhoods like the Third Ward. She had been in the area to interview an elderly resident being priced out of her home when she saw the police cars converge. Her reporter's instincts took over. She had parked at a discreet distance, angled her car for a clear view, and hit record. She had captured it all. The casual, confident way the officers boxed Leo in. The clear fear and confusion on the young man's face. The slow, humiliating act of him placing his backpack on the ground. She zoomed in as the officer opened the notebook, and then she zoomed in on the tense, disbelieving conversation that followed. The climax was perfect, the slow, deliberate presentation of the ID card, and the officer's immediate, palpable shift in demeanor. It was more than just a good clip. It was a perfect, self-contained narrative. A microcosm of everything she had been trying to write about for the past 2 years. Race, class, suspicion, and the invisible credentials one needed to exist peacefully in a changing neighborhood. Back in her small apartment, she watched the footage a dozen times. She transcribed the audio she could make out. The officer's dismissive line, "Propulsion systems for who your science fair project," was pure gold, and the silent, powerful refutation of the NASA badge was the kind of visual poetry a journalist dreams of. She knew she had to be careful. The kid was a minor, but the story was too important. She decided to blur his face just enough to obscure his identity for legal reasons, but not enough to lose the raw emotion in his expression. She wrote the headline, "They called the cops on a black teen with a backpack in the Third Ward. He was a NASA engineer." She added a short, punchy caption. "This is what gentrification looks like. This is what prejudice looks like." A young man walking in his own neighborhood was stopped and questioned by HPD after a "suspicious person" call. His crime, carrying a backpack and writing in a notebook. The confrontation only ended when he proved he was one of the good ones by showing his NASA ID. What if he didn't have a badge? What if he was just a kid who likes to write "watch"? She tagged Black Lives Matter Houston, the local ACLU chapter, and a few progressive city council members. She hesitated for a second, her finger hovering over the post button. This was going to set off a bomb. She hit post. The video didn't just go viral, it detonated. By morning, Houston Unfiltered had crashed twice from the traffic. The video had 1 million views on Twitter, shared by celebrities, activists, and astronauts. The hashtag #NASAHauntUsKid was trending nationally. For Leo, the world turned upside down. His grandmother woke him up, her face etched with worry, holding her tablet. "Leo, baby, you need to see this." He watched the video, his stomach churning. Seeing the incident from an outsider's perspective was surreal. He looked so scared, so young. The blur on his face did little to hide the truth from anyone who knew him. His phone was a ceaseless buzz of notifications. Friends from school, old teachers, cousins he hadn't spoken to in years. Then the media calls started. The Houston Chronicle, ABC News, the Washington Post. At the Johnson Space Center, the story was spreading like wildfire. Leo's mentor, Dr. Aris Evans, a stern but brilliant man who headed the propulsion lab, saw the video before his first cup of coffee. He recognized Leo's lanky frame and the grey Osprey backpack immediately. He felt a cold fury settle in his gut. He had handpicked Leo for the internship, seeing in him a spark of genius he hadn't encountered in years. To see that brilliance treated as a threat was a personal insult. He strode out of his office and found Leo, who had come into work on autopilot, sitting at his cubicle, staring blankly at his screen. "Jones, Dr. Evans," said his voice softer than usual. "My office. Now." Leo followed his heart sinking. He was going to be fired. The negative attention, the controversy. NASA couldn't have that. But when the door closed, Dr. Evans didn't look angry. He looked pained. "Are you okay, son?" he asked. Leo just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. What happened yesterday was unacceptable. Dr. Evans said, his voice low and intense. "You are a member of this family. An attack on you is an attack on NASA and everything we stand for. We explore the universe for God's sake. The idea that one of our own can't safely walk down a street in our own city is untenable." He paused, his gaze steely. "I've already spoken with the director's office and our legal team. We are behind you, 100%. Whatever you need, whatever you want to do, we will support you." A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled Leo's knees washed over him. He wasn't alone. He wasn't fired. He had NASA behind him. Meanwhile, in her pristine craftsman house, Cynthia Miller's world was collapsing. The video was everywhere. Though the camera was positioned from the side, a local news helicopter had eventually flown over the area, and a screenshot of the front of her house, the Community Commons sign she was so proud of clearly visible, was now attached to the story. Amateur internet detectives had cross-referenced that with public property records and her very public profile as the Garden Committee president. Her name, Cynthia Miller, was in the comments section. Then it was in the news articles. Her email inbox was a toxic waste dump of vitriol. Her Facebook page was a graveyard of angry face emojis and comments calling her a racist, a Karen, a monster. Her phone rang incessantly with unknown numbers. Mark had left for work early, his face a grim mask of fury and disappointment. "I told you, Cynthia. I told you to just leave the kid alone." But the worst was yet to come. It came in the form of her son, Josh. Josh was a senior at the prestigious Kincaid School, a private institution that was a world away from the Third Ward. He was smart popular and the captain of the lacrosse team. His entire life had been a carefully curated path toward an Ivy League education. He stormed into the kitchen where Cynthia was numbly staring at her iPad, his face pale with rage. "Mum," he said, his voice trembling. "What did you do?" He threw his phone on the marble countertop. It was open to the video. "Josh, I thought he was suspicious," she stammered. "The neighborhood. I was just trying to keep us safe." "Keep us safe," he yelled, his voice cracking. "By calling the cops on a kid who is probably smarter than my entire class combined. He works for NASA." "Mom." "NASA? Did you even talk to him?" No, You just saw a black kid in a hoodie and decided he was a criminal," Josh shouted. The accusation, so raw and direct from her own son, struck Cynthia with the force of a physical blow. "Do you have any idea what this does to me?" "To us?" "What it does to you?" Cynthia asked, bewildered. "This isn't about you." "Isn't it?" he said with a bitter laugh. "I have my final interview for the Challenger Scholarship at Rice next week. It's an aerospace engineering scholarship, Mum. The biggest one in the state. The selection committee is filled with people from Houston's aerospace industry. People from NASA." The color drained from Cynthia's face. The Challenger Scholarship was everything. It was the key to Josh's future, the validation of all her years of careful planning and sacrifice. "They're all seeing this," Josh continued, his voice dropping to a desolate whisper. "They're all seeing that my mother is Houston's new Karen, the woman who called the cops on a NASA intern for being black in her neighborhood. How do you think that's going to look for me?" Cynthia stared at her son, and for the first time the protective, righteous fury that had fueled her actions dissolved, leaving behind a cold, terrifying void. She hadn't just made a mistake. She hadn't just embarrassed herself. She had taken a stick of dynamite to her son's future and lit the fuse herself. The karma wasn't just knocking on her door. It was about to blow it off its hinges. The days that followed the viral video were not merely a sequence of events. They were a series of controlled detonations, each one reshaping the landscape of their lives. For Leo, it was a sudden, blinding ascent. For Cynthia Miller, it was a terrifying, slow-motion collapse. Leo's grandmother's house became an impromptu command center. The phone rang with a relentlessness that frayed the nerves the callers. A dizzying mix of local news affiliates, national network producers from New York, and even international press from the BBC. His grandmother, a woman whose calm had been forged over 7 decades of life's trials, became his fierce protector and press secretary. "No, he will not be doing a morning show segment," she'd say, her voice honeyed but firm. "The boy has work to do." He and his grandmother would sit at the kitchen table every evening drafting statements with the meticulous care Leo usually reserved for his equations. His first instinct was anger. He wanted to rage against the injustice, the humiliation. But his grandmother guided him toward a different frequency. Anger is a fire that burns the one holding it. "Baby," she told him, her hand covering his. Dignity. Dignity is a shield. It protects you, and it shows them they can't break you. That quiet strength culminated in the press conference at the Johnson Space Center. Standing on a podium flanked by the center's director and a stone-faced Dr. Evans, Leo felt a tremor of imposter syndrome. He was just a kid who liked math. But as he looked out at the sea of cameras and microphones, he thought of his grandmother's words. He delivered his statement with a calm that belied the frantic beating of his heart, hoping this could be a teachable moment about unconscious bias. The director spoke next, his voice booming with authority. "Let me be unequivocally clear," he said, his gaze sweeping across the reporters. "Leo Jones represents the best of this agency. He is brilliant, he is dedicated, and he is the future of American space exploration. An attack on him is an attack on the very soul of our mission, which is to reach for the stars together as one people. NASA is not just in Houston. We are a part of Houston, and we have a responsibility to ensure that every child in this city, regardless of their zip code or the color of their skin, can look up at the moon and see a future for themselves." Then Dr. Evans stepped to the microphone. He spoke not as an administrator, but as a mentor, his voice tight with a contained fury. I recruited Leo for my lab. I read his papers. I've seen the way his mind works. The language he speaks is mathematics, the language of the universe. The idea that this young man was treated as a threat because he was thinking, because he was creating, is an offense to science itself. We will not stand for it. He placed a firm, fatherly hand on Leo's shoulder. We are behind you, Leo. 100%. The dam of opportunity broke. Emails flooded his inbox, the subject lines reading like a dream journal. Scholarship offer, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Invitation to apply, Caltech Aerospace, the Stanford Challenge. A tech billionaire famous for his own aerospace company sent a personal message offering to fund his entire undergraduate and graduate education anywhere in the country. Leo and his grandmother sat on her floral sofa, staring at his laptop screen in stunned silence. He who had been meticulously filling out financial aid forms just weeks ago now had a blank check to the future. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. For Cynthia Miller, the week was a descent into a private hell, each circle hotter than the last. The email from the Oakwood Community Commons Committee was brutal in its politeness. Dear Cynthia, it began, in light of recent events which have brought unwelcome and negative attention to our community initiative, the committee has unanimously voted to seek new leadership effective immediately. We thank you for your past service. She was a pariah in the institution she had created. The shunning was 1,000 tiny cuts. Her neighbor Carol, with whom she'd shared countless glasses of Chardonnay, now fumbled with her keys and hurried inside when Cynthia's garage door opened. People she passed while walking her dog would suddenly become fascinated by something on their phones. She was no longer a person. She was a ghost haunting the pristine streets she had fought so hard to improve. The house became a mausoleum of resentment. Mark's initial fury had cooled into a glacial silence. He moved into the guest room, the closed door a more damning statement than any argument. One evening she tried to breach it. "Mark, please," she said, standing in the hallway. "Talk to me. We can fix this." He opened the door, his face weary and etched with a disappointment that was worse than anger. "Fix what, Cynthia? The fact that you called the police on a child? Or the fact that you might have single-handedly torpedoed our son's future? Did you ever for 1 second stop to think, 'I thought I was protecting us'?" she cried, the defense sounding hollow even to her own ears. "No," he said, his voice flat and cold. "You were protecting an investment. You were protecting your status. You saw a black kid in a hoodie and your mind filled in the rest with garbage from your Facebook group. I told you to leave him alone, Cynthia. I begged you. But you had to be the hero. You had to be the one to keep the community safe." He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Well, congratulations. You're famous now." He closed the door, leaving her alone in the dim light of the hallway. Consumed by a frantic, desperate need to undo the damage, she fixated on the one thing she thought she could control: Josh's scholarship. It became her holy grail, the one act of redemption that could pull her back from the brink. She found the number for the Rice University admissions office, and ignoring the screaming voice in her head that told her it was a terrible idea, she called. The scene played out like a slow-motion car crash she couldn't prevent. Her voice strained and overly formal, demanding to speak to the scholarship committee chair. The polite but firm resistance from the secretary. Her insistence, "It's about the Joshua Miller file. It's urgent." Finally, the calm, cool voice of the man on the other end. Her desperate, rambling explanation about the unfortunate viral incident and the witch hunt. And then the killing blow. The chairman of the Challenger Scholarship Selection Committee this year is Dr. Aris Evans from the Johnson Space Center. The name hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen from the room. Dr. Aris Evans, the man from the press conference, the man whose arm had been a shield for the boy she'd reported. The karma was so specific, so poetically cruel, that it felt like a targeted strike from the heavens. She could barely process the final words that Josh had already withdrawn his application. She hung up the phone, her hand trembling so violently she dropped the receiver into its cradle. He had known. Josh had known it was hopeless and had amputated his own dream to save himself from the infection of her actions. The final act of her reckoning took place that Saturday at Discovery Green. Mark had insisted they go to the Aerospace Innovation Day, his reasoning a form of penance. "You need to see the world you tried to tear down," he'd said. She walked through the cheerful crowds in a fog of shame hiding behind oversized sunglasses, convinced every glance was one of recognition and scorn. And then she saw him. Leo Jones was not on a stage. He was standing beside the gleaming futuristic shell of the Orion capsule, the centerpiece of the NASA exhibit. He was surrounded, but not by reporters. He was encircled by a dozen small children, their faces a mix of black, white, and brown, all upturned, rapt with attention. He wasn't delivering a speech. He was having a conversation. He had a moleskin notebook open, and with a pencil he was patiently sketching the orbital mechanics of a gravity assist. "So you see," he said, his voice alive with a passion that was magnetic, "we borrow a little bit of the planet's momentum, like a slingshot to fling ourselves deeper into space. We're not fighting gravity. We're dancing with it." A little girl with bright pink barrettes raised her hand. "Can I dance with gravity too?" Leo's face broke into a brilliant smile. "Absolutely," he said. "You just have to learn the steps." Watching from a distance, Cynthia felt a profound, soul-crushing vertigo. She had seen this boy as a threat, a thief casing the sprinklers in her garden. And here he was, effortlessly explaining the fundamental forces of the universe to children, his intellect a bright, shining sun. Standing in a respectful orbit around Leo's small group were the giants of the industry: Dr. Evans, the NASA director, the Dean of Engineering from Rice. They weren't managing him. They were admiring him. They were witnessing the very thing they all worked for, the spark of inspiration being passed to the next generation. They were watching the future being born. Josh appeared at her side, his face a mask of quiet resignation. He had seen it too. "That's him, isn't it?" Cynthia whispered the words a surrender. It wasn't a question. The reality of her blunder was no longer an abstract concept like a viral video. It was a living, breathing person, beloved and brilliant, standing 20 feet away. She hadn't just misjudged a situation. She had committed an act of cosmic stupidity. "Yeah, Mom," Josh said. The anger had been burned out of his voice, leaving only the cold ash of sorrow. "That's him." He turned to face her fully, and for the first time she saw not her son, but a man looking at a stranger. He glanced at the wreckage of her social standing, the smoldering crater where his Ivy League dream used to be, and then back at the vibrant scene by the spaceship. "I hope it was worth it," he said, the words delivered not with heat, but with the dead final weight of a closing door. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the anonymous crowd, leaving her utterly alone. Cynthia Miller stood frozen, an invisible woman in the middle of a celebration. She watched as Leo Jones, the boy from her street, put his arm around a small child's shoulders and pointed up at the sky. She had tried to chain him to the pavement to trap him in her own small, fearful world. But she had failed. Some people she finally devastatingly understood were simply meant to fly. And all she had managed to do was irrevocably and permanently ground herself. A year can be a lifetime. In the silent space between one summer and the next, the shockwave from a single phone call settled, and the lives it had violently shaken were irrevocably remade. For Leo Jones, the year was a study in acceleration. He chose MIT, turning down offers from schools closer to home for the chance to work in their legendary Space Systems Laboratory. He arrived in Cambridge, a minor celebrity the NASA kid, who was now officially a rocket scientist in training. The transition was jarring. Students would sometimes point him out in the hallowed infinite corridor, their whispers a constant echo of the incident. Some saw him as a hero, an icon of social justice. Others, a privileged few, saw him as the beneficiary of a media circus, someone who hadn't earned his fame. Leo ignored them all. He found his sanctuary in the lab, a place where the only thing that mattered was the quality of his work. The cold, hard logic of astrodynamics was a balm to the chaotic emotions the incident had stirred up. He poured himself into his studies, his focus so intense it was almost monastic. The sting of the humiliation had faded, but it had been replaced by a quiet, unyielding resolve. He wasn't just working for himself anymore. He felt the weight of expectation, the need to prove that the world's sudden belief in him was not misplaced. His grandmother and Dr. Evans were his anchors. He had a video call with his grandmother every Sunday. Her warm laughter and gentle reminders to eat his vegetables, cutting through the stress of problem sets and exams. Dr. Evans became a true mentor, calling him once a month to discuss not just propulsion theory, but life. "Fame is a distraction, Leo," he'd said once. "Don't let it become your center of gravity. Your mission is the work. Everything else is just noise." Leo took that advice to heart. He ran the Leo's Leaders outreach program with a fierce dedication. Once a month, he'd fly back to Houston for a weekend trading MIT's lecture halls for the noisy gymnasiums of underfunded high schools. He'd stand before kids who looked like him, kids from neighborhoods like his, and he wouldn't just talk about space. He'd talk about doubt, about fear, about feeling like an outsider. He'd pull out one of his moleskin notebooks, its pages now filled with even more complex equations, and show them. "This is my world," he'd say, "and it can be yours too. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you don't belong." The world had tried to define him by one ugly moment. He was determined to redefine himself through 1,000 moments of grace. For Josh Miller, the year was one of reinvention. The implosion of his carefully planned future felt at first like a death. The anger he felt toward his mother was a toxic, corrosive thing. He deferred his admission to all universities and bought a one-way bus ticket to Austin with the money he'd saved, telling his parents he just needed to get away. He got a job on a construction site, swinging a hammer for a non-profit that built affordable housing. The work was brutal humbling. His soft, privileged hands blistered and bled. His body ached in ways he never knew possible. He worked alongside men whose lives were a universe away from Kincaid and lacrosse practice. They didn't care about his SAT scores or his pedigree. They cared if he could carry his weight, if he showed up on time, if he was willing to learn. For the first time, Josh felt truly anonymous, and it was terrifyingly liberating. One afternoon, sitting with his crew during a lunch break, he listened to a man named Rico talk about the family who would be moving into the house they were framing. A single mother, with 3 kids living in a cramped, dangerous apartment. "This house," Rico said, gesturing with a half-eaten taco. "This ain't just wood and nails, man. This is safety. This is a future." In that moment, something shifted in Josh. He had always thought of a house in terms of its market value, its curb appeal. He'd never thought of it as a vessel for a life. He started paying attention, not just to the labor, but to the design. He saw how the placement of a window could flood a room with morning light, how a well-designed kitchen could become the heart of a home. He started sketching ideas in a cheap notebook, not of rockets, but of roof lines and floor plans. His father Mark drove out to see him one weekend. He found his son thinner, calloused, but with a light in his eyes he hadn't seen before. They didn't talk about Cynthia. They talked about joists and foundations. Mark, the investment banker, was fascinated by the economics of non-profit housing. Josh, the former aspiring engineer, explained the architectural challenges with a newfound passion. They were connecting not as a disappointed father and a resentful son, but as 2 men equals. Josh enrolled in the University of Houston's College of Architecture. His Kincaid friends were baffled. Why UH? Why architecture? But Josh knew. He wanted to build things that mattered not for prestige, but for people. He wanted to build communities, not just subdivisions. The fire that had destroyed his path had illuminated a new one that was entirely his own. For Cynthia Miller, the year was a quiet, agonizing reckoning. The public shaming was the easy part. It was a storm that eventually passed. The private shame was a constant low-grade fever. In therapy, her counselor made her confront the question she had been avoiding her entire life. Why were you so afraid? The answer she discovered was ugly and complex. It was a fear of losing control of her investment in the neighborhood souring. It was a fear rooted in the subtle, pervasive racism she had absorbed over a lifetime of privilege. She hadn't seen Leo Jones. She had seen a stereotype, a threat to the fragile, perfect world she had tried to build. Acknowledging this felt like poison. She and Mark began the grueling work of marriage counseling. He was forced to admit his own complicity, the lazy peace he had kept by indulging her anxieties instead of challenging them. "I knew it was wrong, Cynthia," he confessed one session, his voice heavy with regret. "I just didn't want the fight." Their healing began there, in that shared, painful honesty. But Cynthia's true atonement began in the dirt of the Oakwood Community Commons. She volunteered every Saturday, arriving early and staying late. At first, the other members were cold, their silence, a wall of judgment. She didn't blame them. She just kept her head down, pulling weeds, turning compost, her hands blistering just as her son's had. One sweltering July morning, a full year after the incident, Leo's grandmother, Mrs. Jones, was there, tending a bed of collard greens. She had been polite but distant to Cynthia for months. Today, however, she walked over, her face softened by the heat. "You've got a good touch with those tomatoes," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "They've never looked better." The unexpected kindness shattered Cynthia's composure. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed streamed down her face, mixing with the sweat and dirt. "I am so sorry," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "For what I did. For my fear. For the harm I caused your grandson, your family. There is no excuse for it." Mrs. Jones looked at her for a long moment, her gaze deep and knowing. She reached out, not with tomatoes this time, but with her hand, and patted Cynthia's arm. "The good Lord's grace comes not in 'never falling, child,' but in how we get back up," she said softly. "It seems to me you're trying to get back up." It wasn't absolution. Cynthia knew she hadn't earned that. But it was a hand offered in grace. It was a start. That night, Cynthia wrote a letter to Josh. It was 12 pages long. She wrote about her fears, her therapy, her shame. She wrote about Mrs. Jones and the garden. I spent so long trying to build walls to protect a life I thought I wanted, she wrote on the last page. I see now that all I did was build a prison for myself. A real community isn't a fence. It's an open gate. I am only just now learning how to walk through it. I hope one day you and I can walk through it together. She left the letter on his desk for him to find when he came home for Sunday dinner. She didn't know if it would be enough, but as she looked out her window at the community garden, now bathed in the soft light of dusk, she felt something she hadn't felt in a year, a fragile, tender, and deeply precious seed of hope. Leo's story is a powerful reminder that brilliance, passion, and dignity can be the most powerful answers to prejudice. He didn't seek the spotlight, but when it found him, he used it to illuminate a path for others. It's a story about the weight of a backpack filled with dreams and the lightness of a spirit that refuses to be held down by ignorance. The karma in this story wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, poetic, and absolute, a perfect reflection of the actions that set it in motion. If Leo's story of resilience and the triumph of intellect over fear moved you, please give this video a like. It truly helps the channel grow. Share it with someone who needs to hear a story of justice. And most importantly, subscribe for more incredible, true stories where we explore the moments that change lives forever. What did you think of Cynthia's reckoning? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.